gather round for the Oke Farm Pondcast with Doug Davis.
All right. Well, so for those listening, I almost always start this up and say, you have no idea what we're going to talk about. That's kind of the way we start this off. And up until episode 19, that has been the case every time.
We're breaking the rule.
Today, we're doing something a little different. You emailed me the other day, and you're like, hey, we were going back and forth about the Okefenokee, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but you're like, why don't we spend some time updating everybody on kind of what's going on, address maybe some of the discussion that we're at least aware of over the last few years, the pros and the cons, and just spend a little bit of time reflecting on this new designation. So that was very cryptic, I know, what I just said. So why don't you update us, Curtis? Give me the skinny on what just happened, so that the viewers might be aware if they're not already.
Sure. And another thing that's new is actually having a laptop in front of me so that I'm somewhat tethered to the truth and not just making stuff up as I go along, as some of our longtime viewers may have recognized in the past. So the big news is, let's see now, 3 days ago, the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so this is big news for essentially our next door neighbor. Those who will be familiar where the farm is located is we're sitting literally adjacent to the refuge itself. And this is a process that I just learned recently has been going on for something like 3 or 4 decades.
Yeah.
And then really sort of in earnest, maybe the last 10 years or so, and led by a great collection of people, many of whom we know and consider to be friends of the farm. And so this is, I'm sure, a feeling, a time of relief and excitement and joy for them. But for many people in this area, it could be, they may not be having the same feelings, right? They may feel like some of our local leaders have left us in a bit of a lurch, maybe outsourcing some, sovereignty or control or decision-making to the refuge, to authorities outside of Georgia and outside of the United States. And so, I thought, because you can't have a conversation about the topic in this community without also mentioning that there's people against it.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's something that I've noticed since coming here. And so I thought, and we haven't really talked about it that much, I thought, who better to have a conversation about this than those of us who live and work here adjacent to the park and to the refuge. And, to try to take a rational and reasonable approach to understanding both sides, weigh the pros and cons of each, and hopefully, we'll provide some information that viewers of this podcast can think about, ultimately make a decision for themselves.
Right.
The reality is the decision has been made, so it's something that we're going to live with, and good or bad or indifferent. And so I thought, let's have a conversation about it. But what I really wanted to do too is invite you, as someone who has invested so much of yourself and your family, into this project. I'd like to hear from you, your perspective about it. I would guess, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would guess when you started this project, you probably weren't aware of the effort to inscribe the refuge as a World Heritage Site. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah. Well, let me start by just acknowledging, or trying to be honest about any biases that I might come to this with, and so. I think the first bias is we know the outcome. So my opinions, at least going forward, are going to be shaped and steeped through the lens through which I see it, which is a done decision. Like there's no appeal. Like it is done. The Okefenokee is a World Heritage Site. So there's components to that I get really excited about, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But back to the biases, when I started this project, I was completely unaware of this effort, and I have to say, and so that was, believe it or not, going on 5 years ago, which is still hard for me to believe. But increasingly over that period of 5 years, I felt like when people would ask me about it, and I got asked periodically whether it was locals or whether it was prospects or people directly involved themselves, they would ask me my position. I have to be honest, I've been relatively agnostic. I felt like that if it happened, there would be a lot of good that went along with it. But if it didn't happen, we were going to be just fine at the farm at Okefenokee regardless. And so I want to come to it saying that I've always never held a very strong opinion one way or the other. And so it was and continues to be easy for me to find all of the positives in what this means for us. So, but back to your specific question, over the last several years, when I thought about the possibility of the farm becoming it was an inductee. It was on the long list for many years, and it was on the short list, and it was going through a process of deep evaluation. For me, I really didn't know if it would ever happen or not. It felt like a very long, dragged out process that could just continue to go on and on. Having been involved with regulators both at the state, the local, and the federal levels, never at the international level, but I've had projects that have been enthralled within permitting for many years. And so with something like this, I could see it going on forever. So I didn't have any anticipation that it was going to come to an end. So that was, I guess, part of my perspective is I was just holding out to wait to see what happened. But now that, again, we're at the finish line, there's a lot of things that I find very positive, but like you, I think it would be insensitive of us not to spend at least a little bit of time talking about some of the views others have held. Even though this hasn't been my personal view, one of the things you mentioned a few seconds ago that comes up a lot is this idea of sovereignty. Yeah. And when I think about the owners here at the farm at Okefenokee and the people that are interested in becoming owners, one of the characteristics I would largely describe them as is people who appreciate sovereignty. They want to be able to make their way. They wanted to by virtue of being here at the farm, they want to understand where their food comes from. They want to, have a close knit community. All of these things kind of are inherent in who they are. And so I think it's only natural that some of them fall on either side of the idea that it becomes a UMAM site or not. But this idea of sovereignty. And so, I mean, like you, I guess, I think it might be fun to talk about maybe what that means. Like, what does it mean to be concerned about sovereignty? Yeah. Why would they be concerned about sovereignty? What does it mean? What is our opinion of what it means to be on the other side of not worrying about being sovereignty? So I feel like that was a really long response, but I guess said more simply, Curtis, I show up to this having never really had any expectations one way or another. I was excited to hear for the people that I know put a lot of work in it, but I was also, there was a little bit of concern for me for the people that didn't want it. And so I feel like I'm more of a blank canvas when it comes to this. Yeah. I don't know. What about you? How do you feel?
Well, let me perhaps go through my story about how I came to hear about it. We're coming up on 2 years that we've lived here. Obviously, the process to move here started at least a year before that. And I, as a native of Jacksonville, Florida, born and raised an hour and 15 minutes from where we sit right now, I had never visited the refuge before. I knew it by name. The only thing I knew about Folkston, to be honest with you, was that when growing up watching the evening news, the local weatherman, George Winterling, would always, on the big map, always had Folkston up there, So I was like, okay, we have that in common. Like, at least we're in the same region,
Right.
the same television station region. That's all I really knew of Folkston, right? And so we came up here. Obviously, we were tracking the progress through you, and based on our relationship of more than 20 years now, we were really curious about this project, and so ultimately that led to us leaving our home in St. Augustine and moving up here. And it was only after, I'm not 100% certain, but I would venture to say it was after we had already signed the contract to move forward that I even got wind of the fact. I probably saw an article somewhere, probably popped up, and I was like, what is this? To be honest with you, I wasn't familiar with the World Heritage Program through UNESCO. And living in this part of the country, why would you be? There's not any other World Heritage sites. I mean, we do have the Everglades 5-6 hours away. There's the Great Smoky Mountains. I've been to both of those places, but I never went there because it was a World Heritage site, and that's why I wanted to go, So I said, my first reaction was relatively positive. I might say, oh, well, that's cool. We're going to be living next to a site that is, from what I can tell, is a pretty high distinction for a natural site. I mean, it places it in very good company. A very small percentage of the sites around the world have achieved the level of this designation. So I would say it was, relatively positive. And then I began to see, the first thing that I saw there was any opposition to it was I saw signs driving in, and signs, that said, keep the UN out of
everywhere.
Okefenokee.
I mean, just all throughout the county.
And so I said, okay. Now, they tied it directly to the UN. Okay. And so, as someone who would not consider themselves a big fan of the UN or globalist agendas or the World Economic Forum or any of these, organizations which have largely been demonized, I think, and rightly so, by a lot of the people that I'm in circles with talking about. I have visions of the Klaus Schwab guy who seems like a evil international supervillain telling me that I'm going to be eating bugs and renting, and I'm going to be happy about it, right?
Exactly.
Like, that's, my mind goes to that when I start thinking about that class of people. So I can see where it's easy to make that leap.
Yep.
Okay. And then what I did in my head, and I'll admit that this was a mistake, is I immediately discounted that argument to those people probably are doing the same thing.
Right.
They're probably just lumping it in, and what is the UN really going to do in South Georgia? Right. Like, or are they going to send a peacekeeping force here to come invade the swamp and take it over? And I didn't. I read. I will admit that I read the charter, the charter documents for World Heritage Site, just to make sure. The one thing that in getting back to this idea of sovereignty, I wanted to ensure myself, at least be confident that there was no way any encroachment on property ownership of the swamp, sovereignty, decision-making control, all of those things. And at least what I read at that point eased my mind that there was. And then in fact, there absolutely is no control of either ownership of the swamp or regulatory decisions made by the current organizations that do. Right. So we sort of take that off the table. The mistake I made was that I didn't go deeper, into those arguments, and it's only been recently that I tried to get a better idea of their side and really try to steelman what is the best argument for keeping the UN designation of World Heritage Site. Like, what harm does that do? And so I'd like to explore that a little bit and maybe come up with some, potential scenarios. The other thing that I think needs to be addressed is one of the strongest arguments for the proponents of it is that there is going to be a significant increase in economic benefit to those cities and counties and businesses that provide services as a result of the designation. I have seen some wild estimates as much as almost a doubling of the increase in the number of people who are going to visit the swamp, and I think that's something that should be looked at as well, because if you look at what has happened to other World Heritage Sites, although there hasn't been one named in the United States in a long time, but still, we can go back and look at visitor data, both before and after the designation was inscribed. And I think that's a worthwhile exercise for us too, because maybe that can temper some expectations of how big of an impact is it actually going to have from an economic standpoint. So those are the two things that I think that we could explore in this conversation, which I think would be the strongest arguments both for and against having the designation.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I would add one other potentially, and again, I don't know that I have the right answer to this, but trying to put myself in the position of those who would, be against it. Having spent my entire career pretty much working through land entitlement, zoning, conservation-based issues, I would say another issue that folks may be concerned about are neighboring landowners, and maybe they were and or are concerned about higher levels or higher thresholds that are either they would be required to go through or maybe thrust upon them through buffers or through other conservation efforts in order to protect the asset. And so I think that's probably another one that may be worthwhile just to talk about for a few minutes as well.
Yeah, that was actually the second. So I'm just going to throw out what I think are the two top concerns of those. The first is soft power erosion of sovereignty and local control.
Okay.
And to dig into that a little bit deeper, even if legal title and day-to-day management remain with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, inscription places the site under ongoing international monitoring. Adversarial nations sit on the UNESCO bodies. Opponents argue that recommendations, state of conservation reports, or an eventual in danger listing create political pressure that Washington or Atlanta will find difficult to ignore. So that's one. And then the second one is, and I believe what you were touching on, pressure on private lands and traditional uses adjacent to the refuge.
Yeah.
The refuge covers most of the swamp, but private timber, agricultural and residential lands border it, including us. Locals fear informal buffer zone expectations, heightened scrutiny of logging, herbicide use, hunting practices, or development near the boundary, and the risk that international prestige makes it easier for outside groups to litigate or lobby against ordinary rural land uses. And there's some interesting case study that sort of address these two issues on a actual cultural site, not a natural site, but a cultural World Heritage Site in Poland that I think is worth looking at. So
before you do that, let me just throw out for those listening something that I learned from the executive director here, even before I learned about this possible UNESCO designation. When I first arrived and met with the executive director of the refuge, one of the things that he explained to me that I never knew about, maybe this will be helpful for others, is, whenever you are traveling the country and you think about a national park, what is the difference between a national park and a national wildlife refuge? And I mean, if others are like me, I didn't know the difference. And they're nuanced. Both of them fall kind of beneath the Bureau of Land Management. Both of them are federal. The national park system, as I understand it, is really focused on making sure that the general public has access to these scenic areas, this absolute beautiful scenery. You think about Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, the Badlands, all that kind of stuff. And then the national wildlife refuges are I'm not going to say the opposite, but the the management objective is very different.
Yeah.
The first one is managed for the populace.
Yep.
The second is managed for the wildlife.
Yeah.
And so the purpose of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who has jurisdiction managing the refuge, their sole purpose is to protect the biodiversity, the animals, all of that other stuff. And so all of their decisions that govern how the populace uses that park, it all rotates and evolves around that one use. So, we enjoy fishing and hunting because those are ways that we conserve those resources out there. And so anyways, I didn't mean to go too much on a tangent, but I think it's helpful to at least understand who's in charge of regulating this area that we're talking about.
Yeah.
What is their management purposes and why do they do what they do? So anyways, with that, jump in.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I was out in the swamp fishing just the other day, and the Okefenokee Adventures guide boats go by me, routinely, and so I listen in to the conversation that the guides. I mean, they have great guides out there, and that's one of the first things that they say. Because when I'm near the boat basin, maybe I'm pulling my boat out or whatever. That's the first distinction that they make, that this is not a national park. It's not managed the same way.
Yeah.
It's managed by Wildlife and Fisheries. So the I want to take a look at this. So what teeth or governing authority does UNESCO have? And I think the strongest case, and I have read this from some of the opponents of the World Heritage Site designation, is through the use of the UN's SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, right? And so there is this concept, and you sort of have to think this through how it would happen, but that there would not be any sort of change in the local governing bodies. But over time, individuals who serve on those bodies, okay, and I'm talking about our county commissioners, other regulatory agencies, could be, organizations involved in public-private partnerships with the refuge, etc., could be influenced by these sustainable development goals and thinking that, okay, we should place some priority in the decision making that we make in alignment with these SDGs. Okay, and that over time that could be the influence that is had and could make some incremental change in how particularly private land is used. If my understanding is correct, there is no buffer zone for the refuge because of its size.
Right.
They agreed that there was no need to create an additional buffer, right? So that's on our side. That should give private landowners some level of comfort. They're not in a buffer zone.
We're talking about 500,000 acres to give everybody an idea of how large this area is.
That's hard for a lot of people. It's hard for me. I guess another way to describe it, that I describe it to folks, people who are familiar with Duval County, which is the county in which the city of Jacksonville and one are combined. It is it's one of the unique cities in the United States where the city and county government
largest city landmass wise there is.
The Okefenokee is roughly 80% the size of Duval County.
Yeah,
that's pretty big.
Yeah, because it'll take you an hour and 10 minutes to drive from one side to the other sometimes. And if you fly over this area, or if you look at any satellite imagery, nighttime satellite imagery, which shows all the lights, you will see a big black hole in southeast Georgia, directly northwest of Jacksonville, and that's the Okefenokee, which also makes it a dark sky, official dark sky location. So. But back to this idea, in this study that I mentioned, and I'll post it in the notes for anybody who wants to read it. I read a summary of it. I'll admit I didn't read the whole thing. But the example was
Now, again, take into consideration, this is Europe. This was a site that had been designated decades ago.
That's the one in Poland you mentioned?
Yeah,
Okay.
the one in Poland. So we're not comparing apples to apples. It is quite different. In Europe, the general temperature of the populace tends to be more in agreement with the United Nations
Right.
and globalist type objectives. And so what they were able to demonstrate in this journal was that the influence of the Sustainable Development Goals did have a subtle influence in the decision-making authorities that were in and around this particular cultural site. Okay, so I say all that to say that is a very real concern, right? But then you have to look at what the SDGs are,
Right.
okay, and what is the Sustainable Development Goal that would be perhaps most pertinent to our situation, and I'll even localize it with the farm at Okefenokee, and that sustainable development goal is called life in land, or let me give you the exact reading of it. Life on land. Okay, it's SDG 15, and it directly involves biodiversity protection, habitat connectivity, and ecosystem integrity around the swamp. Easiest pathway for recommendations that affect private land management, buffer concepts, or traditional uses near the refuge. I'm gonna let you think about that for a second. But when I read that, from the farm's perspective, I see us for the most part well in alignment with what that objective is, or what that goal is. In fact, did you listen to the conversation with Zach Bush and Joe Rogan that came out last week?
No.
Highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Great guy. One of the best conversations that I've heard in a while. But he introduced this concept to me that I had never heard of before, called keystone species.
Yes.
You're
I'm
familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so a keystone species, in a nutshell, is one that thrives in the environment that it's in, and it is doing everything it can to perpetuate and regenerate that ecosystem, right? So regenerative farming to me is a synonym, if you will, with keystone species, using the land. And so now there are other uses of land in and around the Okefenokee that may feel threatened by that for whatever they're using it for. It could be a mining operation, it could be a timber operation, who knows what it is.
Yeah.
And so putting your conservationist hat on, but also someone who is deeply tethered to sovereignty and the individual in the rights of an individual to use the land in which the way they want to. How do you react to that?
Yeah. So my mind immediately. This is, by the way, I'm reacting this real time. I have not seen the study, or we haven't talked about the stuff ahead of time, other than to know the general topic we're going to discuss.
Yeah.
My mind immediately goes to I'm going to maybe take an alternative position than the one we've been talking about, but I can't help because it's so compelling for me. So in the context of our discussion right now, we're talking about these design guidelines that would potentially impact the regulatory bodies around the greater area that we're in right now. But what I would tell you is the same concept already exists in Florida, where I spent much of my career. Even though I wasn't down in South Florida where there's a UNESCO site, just the Osceola Forest, the Ocala Forest, the Matanzas, greater area, those are all national park areas. And there were, even outside of those, there are state parks, there are city parks and everything else. And I can tell you, having done work in these areas, that even without the UN, there's a lot of pressure to think through guidelines that would help facilitate the motility of wildlife species. You're talking about keystone species. A lot of times we talk in terms of umbrella species. So if you're planning for this particular species, by virtue of its habitat and nest needs, you're saving all of this other habitat and stuff. And so I guess kind of on the converse side, or the opposite side of worrying about the UN, like, these are, whether or not the UN does this, these are already things that are already impact and pressures that already exist as it relates to conservation. And so that was my immediate reaction when you said you were talking about these wildlife corridors and these different conservation areas. That stuff is already kind of part of the DNA of doing any real projects these days. So I, again, kind of going back and forth, putting on different hats, I'm not sure that the UN designation in and of itself increases that, but maybe there is a higher level of scrutiny that exists. But yeah, that was my reaction to that particular thing. And as far as the way I feel about it, the whole idea of sovereignty, I mean, for the most part, no matter, again, I don't want to speak specifically for any particular landowners or anybody in this area. I'm talking more at large. But, I do think that if you own land, no matter where you're at, you're going to be subject to complying with whatever land use regulations, zonings, overlay districts, or whatever else may exist in the area. And so it's not like anyone, for the most part, can just say, I'm going to do this with my land, then I'm going to do it. So there's not, it's funny, some of our viewers may know this because of who they listen to, but I've had on at least 3 occasions now, people come out here and ask me about this concept of alloidial rights. Have you ever heard this before? I'd never heard of it before. And it's this philosophy that, the same way that we believe through the Constitution, we have these inalienable rights to, pursuit of freedom and happiness and religion and so forth. Well, this alluvial, I think that's the way you say it, right, they believe that if they own the land, nobody can tell them anything about their land. And so before they bought out here at the farm, they wanted to make sure that they had alluvial rights. And I would tell people, and I believe this, again, having been in the business for 30 years now, there is no such thing as alluvial rights. Your land is always subject to ad valorem taxes, federal, restrictions if there are. I mean, like, there's a whole layer of bureaucracy that land is just subject to. We're not in a new world that we've charted this land and we're laying claim and we're making up the rules. The reality of it is we do operate, even when we have title to a piece of land, we're subject to local ordinances, local zoning at the state level, the federal level, and so forth. So yeah, I don't know that I'm answering it directly, but they're not. There's never an easy answer. I mean, sovereignty exists on a continuum. Yeah. You and I want to pursue higher levels of sovereignty, but you're never going to be completely sovereign, no matter what subject you're talking about.
Yeah. I agree. So I want to maybe put a conclusion to the concern about soft influence in local governing bodies. Okay, using the Poland World Heritage Site as an example, how I would view that, what would have to happen. Okay, to your point, the governing bodies don't change, and the people in those governing bodies don't change. Okay, in that example, an extreme example, maybe these organizations recruit people who were formerly on the opposition and bring them in to the organization. I mean, I'm trying to use an example here. Maybe our county commissioners, for example. so that there is there's a seat at the table for someone for an opposing voice, perhaps to some of this regulatory influence. But at the end of the day, it's the same people. It's the same organizations and same people.
Yeah.
So the perceived threat that I think I'm understanding is that our own representatives would be subject to and would exercise influence from foreign interests,
Right.
foreign countries. And thinking about that, what I would propose to the people who are concerned about that is that already exists.
Yeah.
It already exists at the federal government level.
Yeah.
Okay, and it doesn't take too much research to just see what's going on. So that's a risk that we live under, and it happens to us on a day-to-day basis. And so then I have to measure, those risks. I mean, like if the federal government is making decisions about the tax dollars that we pay, that I pay, and they're using that to go fight wars, for example, or to bail out financial institutions, or whatever the case may be. If it's something I don't agree with, like my only access to that is through
voting.
Through representative government, right?
Yeah.
And if I discover that my representatives seem to be placing the interests of other countries, other authorities over our own, then it's my responsibility and it's our community's responsibility to take action and put people in there who are going to be looking out for the best interest. So it's a responsibility that does not change.
Right.
Responsibility lies with us and with our communities to make sure that we're voting in the representatives that make the best decisions. So in terms of what can be influenced upon the swamp, whether it be through these SDGs or anything else, I have yet to find anything that gives me major cause for concern when weighed against all the other risks that are out there in the world, right? And so that doesn't discount that argument. It just tells me, for me and my calculation of that, I don't see, ultimately, I think that the inscription of the World Heritage Site is a recognition and a badge and an honor and a distinction for a natural area, wild area that we live adjacent to, that is so significant from a biodiversity standpoint that it deserves that recognition. Yeah. And I don't see it much more than that at this point.
I don't either. Let me go just real quick. I just want to summarize, because you did a good job of, I think, bringing this back together. What I heard you say is there are really two obvious risk points. There's in each falls within the geographic boundary of the areas we're talking about. One risk point, the one we spend a lot of time talking about, falls outside of the swamp in the areas around it, right?
Yeah.
And those areas are absolutely have no touch other than the soft influence that you're describing through everything happens. I mean, if people don't realize this, they need to understand your life, all of our lives around the country are almost entirely impacted by local government more than anything else, right? Like, in other words, certainly there's things with our tax dollars that do happen, but our day-to-day lives, whether we're sitting in traffic or whether, something happens, like, all those decisions are done at the local level. And so back to your point, just to bring this to a conclusion, the UN has absolutely no say over what happens, number one, anywhere in the country, but especially to steelman that argument in the local elections. And so as the people of the surrounding areas, they continue to enjoy both the right, the privilege, and the obligation to elect leaders that are consistent with the way they want their counties, cities, and areas governed. As simple as that.
Yep.
Simple as that. It really needs to go no farther than that. Those are the people that are representing them and making the decisions in the areas around the UNESCO area, period. The other thing that you brought to a head was, okay, that's outside. Now, if you jump into the swamp, what impact does the UN have? And to your point again, really, other than just being a badge of honor, U.S. Fish and Wildlife is really not impacted on their day-to-day management.
That's right.
The only impact, if we're being honest, that probably could happen is with additional people coming in, they may have to expand some of the offerings, with maybe add some boardwalks, or maybe the visitor center gets larger. Like there's some practical things to facilitate interest in the area, but the overall management, I just don't think there's any proof or any reason for us to believe that the complexion of the way that it's managed changes one iota.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway. And so, ultimately, to your point, what does that mean to the farm? Coming full circle back to where I started, even though I was somewhat agnostic coming into the process, now that we are here, the swamp's been awarded the UNESCO Heritage, I'm really excited about it. My lack of emotion previously has now turned to excitement. I think that there's way more positive outcome for the area and for us in particular than there was before. And so I'm super excited about it. I want us to, as a community, to make sure that we're, benefiting from it as much as possible and being a part of the solution as much as possible. But, again, if you're thinking about being an owner here, I think this only solidifies what we've already done. You're talking about dark skies. I think this reinforces the fact that this is such an important area that it will remain untouched and undeveloped, and so that you'll maintain the dark skies. The biodiversity of the combination of the uplands and the wetlands with the different species and that either nest or range here will be protected. The fact that these are the lungs of our area and the air quality here will be protected. All of these things are awesome. Yeah. This is what we would want as a community, is to make sure that the banks of what we live next to will be protected in perpetuity and recognized for how wonderful it is.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Let's talk about the expectations of increase in tourism and visitors to the farm, because this was a bit of surprise to me when I got this information, and it's not an exact comparison. So I think there are some unique things about time and place, where we are, what's going on in this part of the country, changes in habits and of people to be able to travel, what they're interested in, So you have to throw all those variables, but I'm going to use two examples. And
you said people coming to the farm. Did you mean the farm or the swamp?
I meant the swamp.
I just want to make sure I'm following. Yeah, you said farm. I just want to make sure I'm tracking.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Let me reset that.
Yeah.
The expectations for increase in visitation to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge.
Gotcha.
Because that has been one of the arguments that I think has been made for, is that this is great. It's going to bring more people to our area. It'll benefit businesses in Folkston and in Waycross. So the three counties most likely to benefit from this are going to be Charlton, Ware, and Clinch counties, right? And so I wanted to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Because right now the Okefenokee gets roughly 800,000 visitors a year, something like that. And I have seen in some of the materials that the expectation is that there will be a doubling of that in the years ahead. And I'm just going to say that that's probably an overestimation of what we can expect.
I would think so.
And if we just look at, I'm just going to use the two natural World Heritage Sites, because they're all cultural sites and natural sites. The two natural sites closest to us are Everglades National Park, which received its inscription in 1979, and the Great Smoky Mountains, which was inscribed in 1983. So the average annual visitors 5 years before inscription for the Everglades was 878,000. So from 1974 to 1978, on average, they had 878,000 people visited Everglades. in the 5 years after, the average annual visitors actually dropped to 613,000.
Yeah.
So who knows what, there could have been a multitude of reasons for that. But from 1980 to 1984, it saw a decrease of 30% in annual visitors. Okay. Now contrast that with the Great Smoky Mountains. Its average annual visitors in the 5 years before was 8.33 million. And that's probably a harder figure because how do you count visitors to the Great Smoky Mountains? But still, that's whatever way they figured to calculate this. It was, and this information comes from the National Park Service. So 8.33 million a year in the 5 years leading up to the inscription, and 9.33 million in the 5 years after. So an increase of 12%.
Yeah.
So a modest increase there. So just looking at those two examples right there, it's hard to use
Hard
that
to imagine
to predict.
that it would be.
It's hard to predict. So,
Yeah. But I mean, even at 12, I mean, that's a big difference between, if they're saying that it's going to double, it's a big difference between 12%.
If I had to guess, I'm just going to, there's three main points of entry into the refuge. There's the east entrance, which is here in Folkestone. There's a north entrance, which is in Waycross.
Which is 45 minutes.
Yeah, about 45 minutes away.
Yeah.
And then there's the west entrance all the way on the other side, which I've never been in.
I've never been there either.
Stephen Foster Park through Fargo.
It'd probably hour
and 15
minutes or so if you drove it, probably.
Yeah. I think the entrance that has the greatest likelihood of benefiting from it is the east entrance because of our proximity to Jacksonville. So the largest major metropolitan area to the refuge is Jacksonville, with roughly a population of something north of 1 million.
Yeah.
Let's call it 1.1, maybe 1.2 million, something like that. And if I had to guess, just based on my own experience as a native of Jacksonville, probably 980,000 of those inhabitants probably have never been to the Okefenokee.
Yeah, and that's probably probably being generous.
That might even be generous. So very few people.
Very few people.
I do think that there is a trend for people. I don't know. I'd love to hear you weigh in on this. But people who want to spend time experiencing, whether it's their vacation time or whatever, the experiences I think I suspect are being driven more around reconnection with nature.
Yeah.
And discovering wild places. And I suspect that the World Designation Site status will have an influence on our nearly 1 million neighbors 1 hour south of us, and will create some curiosity to them saying, if this place that I've never heard of before, or maybe I've heard of and never visited before, has attained this designation, which places it in very rare company of sites around the world, maybe I owe it myself and my family to go take a visit and see what it's like. And I think that's where we're most likely to see an influx of visitors. Now, I do believe that there's probably some people who, not many Americans, but maybe Europeans and people from other international citizens of the world, they may, look at World Heritage Sites as something on a bucket list to check off and to visit. And maybe we'll see an influx of people like that who are curious and want to come. But I do have hopes that, at least from my experience, I love the swamp. As you know, I'm in it multiple times a week, fishing and enjoying it. I never could have imagined all those years living in Jacksonville and St. Augustine that something so beautiful was only an hour and a half up the road. And I think that through the services that are even existing right now being provided by Okefenokee Adventures, for example, that it's very easy for someone to plan a day trip out of Jacksonville, to drive the hour and 15 minutes from town, or hour and 30 if you live at the beaches, to come in and spend 2 or 3 hours exploring something that is just absolutely majestic.
So let me maybe if we're wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, because I think for those listening, I mean, you've done a much better job of having some coherent thought to your lines of logic and so forth. But I feel like I've kind of bounced all around, and just to kind of bring this back around for takeaways, we've been trying to articulate different potential objectives or observations or sides to this overall designation. If I were to ask Curtis Hazel, as someone who loves the swamp, who's someone who loves the farm at Okefenokee, what is your takeaway by the designation? Like, or is over just as an overreaching few statements, like,
I'm gonna make this comparison, and I don't know if it's a great comparison or not, but I'm gonna use it at the risk of sounding like I'm talking about myself or being arrogant. When I was in my late 30s in Jacksonville, I received this designation from the Jacksonville Business Journal called 40 Under 40. Mm-hmm. And it was like an annual thing that they did each year for, there were a number of things that went into it.
Yeah.
Right? I got it when I was like 38 or 39 or something like that. And, I thought, that's pretty cool, and then it gave me some kind of, thing to put on my mantle, and that was it. And I never, I was in the insurance business at the time. I never gained one client out of it. It was just a nice thing to say. People would, that were in my network would say, oh, that's, congratulations, you were 40 under 40, yeah. Right? But it didn't mean anything at the end of the day, right? I don't want to say that this doesn't mean anything, because that would be a discredit to all the people who put a lot of work into this. But as far as how it impacts my day-to-day of interacting with the swamp, mm-hmm. I don't expect to see a significant change.
Yeah.
I think that maybe some of the guide boats that aren't full will be full.
Yeah.
And maybe they add one or two to the schedule. I think that the amenities around the entrances, the access points to the swamp will be improved. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to change my day-to-day interaction with the swamp or how I live at the farm. I don't think it's going to change Jenny and I's interaction. I think it is something really nice to talk about. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something that, we can use in telling the story about the farm. The farm is adjacent to this World Heritage Site. But that's about it.
Yeah. I think for me, I am, I mentioned this before, I'm excited. I'm excited about the designation. I don't spend as much time out in the swamp as you do, nowhere near as much. I'm tethered to the farm. Mm-hmm. But as I think about why this area is so special, it's really, number one, it's the people. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, the people are what make it. This isn't going to impact the people. The people are going to stay. The people mm-hmm. are going to continue to run the government. Like this area is the people. The other thing is the swamp is so important to this area. And I just look at it as just one more level of protection to make sure that something that is so precious to me and to so many others is going to remain the same way it looks today, so that my great grandkids can be out there. Mm-hmm. And so I really honestly, if I was pushed, I don't see a downside emerging mm-hmm. as a result of the designation. I see only upside. I really do. Mm-hmm. I really do. So, and I have not spent near the amount of time that you have, obviously, really thinking about this, because I appreciate you having done that. But I have spent some time reflecting on it, and I have to say I'm excited. Mm-hmm. I'm excited for what it means to the farm. I'm excited to what I think it will mean to these counties that mm-hmm. are some of the most impoverished in the state of Georgia.
That's right.
And so I'm excited about our future. And so I appreciate you coming up with the idea to discuss this. I hope that those listening, that maybe somebody out there got something. If it was nothing other than the inspiration to want to do a little bit more research and figure out for themselves. And so, any closing thoughts on your side?
There's one thing I want to end with.
Yeah.
And so what I also thought about is, look, even though I'm from Jacksonville, an hour and a half away, I don't consider myself a local. I've only been here 2 years, and so I've thought about what would the real pioneers and the people who've spent, generations here, and the families who've spent generations here, like, what would the old timers, think about it? What would and I think that we have a clue.
Okay.
I found a clue.
All right.
So this book, the history of the.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay. This is a book that was published exactly 100 years ago, in 1926, and it was co-authored by A.S. McQueen and Hamp Mazzell. Okay, the name we are very familiar with, and locals will be very familiar with. And it's a fascinating book. If anyone wants to learn about the swamp, I don't think there's a better collection of stories to describe what it was like here 100 years ago. And you think about what was going on in the country back then. The conservation movement nationally was really just beginning to take a foothold, right? And there was this recognition that maybe we need to set some lands aside to protect for future generations.
Thank goodness.
And so I'm going to read the last paragraph of this book in closing. And it's my opinion that the authors of this book, I think, at the end of the day, would be very pleased with the decision made to inscribe the Okefenokee as a World Heritage Site. So it says, coming back to the subject of preservation of this great swamp as a sanctuary for disappearing wildlife of the Southeast, the writer believes that it will yet become a reality. He bases his belief on the fact that it will be brought about by those big, noble, wholehearted men and women of this nation, men and women who spend their lives in this great work, demanding that a sanctuary be provided for the fast disappearing wildlife of this section. These men and women who live in the open spaces are not narrow and sectional and are not petty politicians, but they are usually of such caliber that politicians will lend to them an attentive ear. The intelligent, earnest scientist will also lend his aid in this work, and when the proper concerted pressure is brought to bear, as I firmly believe it will in time, the worthy object will be accomplished. If this little rambling booklet will aid in any measure in bringing about this object, then the authors will feel that they have not labored in vain.
Boy, that was fortuitous.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that was beautiful. All right. Well,
one word to close. I'm going to say conservation, and I'm out.
Well, if it's possible, you stole mine of all the possible things, which is kind of cool, I guess, that we were both thinking on that same term. I will go with optimistic, and I'm out.
All right. Thanks.
Good job.